Didn't get tired from yesterday. Cool. So, yeah, just reminder again, proposals due tomorrow by lunch. Okay. So I got some, but everyone needs to submit. So today I am very excited to introduce our speaker who just came from the airport. He traveled from the US and just arrived 2 hours ago, right? So Manuel Schottdorf, I know him for quite some time. I wouldn't say how many years just not to make us look old. I remember him as a lab rotation student and he studied physics and did his PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization, studying collective dynamics of neural networks and how patterns emerge, did experiments, but also did theoretical work on the visual cortex. And if you know Manuel, you know that he liked instruments, new instruments, building instruments, and also try to answer some questions. Not only, there are some people who just like to build instruments, but he also like to answer questions with them. He's pretty interdisciplinary in his interests, from physics to biology, but then outside he is a deep thinker, and he worked on some labor rights stuff when he was at Princeton. So yeah, you will enjoy talking with him. And he recently became a professor at University of Delaware in the United States. And the structure today will be like yesterday. He will give his 2 talks, and there will be a discussion in the middle. I think he has some numerical exercises for the discussion. So, you know, knowing Manuel, he will keep you busy throughout this whole day. He will also be giving the colloquium today, which you will then see the whole institute will be here. He also will join you for the group paper discussion, you know, to answer some questions and stuff like this. Okay, without further ado, the stage is yours.
Good morning, you all. And thank you, Ahmed, for the very, very kind words. You had a lot more influence on my scientific trajectory than you care to admit. When I started in the life sciences, I was a naive young theoretical physicist. I was excited about Lagrangians and symmetries and things like that. And I ended up just dabbling a little bit in neuroscience. And then Ahmed came along and told me, you should do experiments. You know, here's a cell culture. Do something exciting with it. And that really changed my scientific trajectory quite profoundly. So even though my background is in physics, I'll talk about this a little bit more. Nowadays, I'm a 90% experimental neuroscientist, mostly doing cutting-edge scientific instrumentation and trying to better understand the collective dynamics of large populations of neurons while animals engage in exciting behaviors. I'll show a few examples of that later today too. But what we will talk about today is an example of what I think is one of the most remarkable contributions of theoretical physics into computational neuroscience. This is work that I did partially during my PhD, but it is built on the shoulders of previous giants and many generations of previous graduate students and our old advisor, Fred Wolf, and we should pay due credit to their remarkable achievements. In the first talk, I will talk about this background and contextualize the kind of science that they did, and then I'll show a cutting-edge kind of research applications, how we further our understanding of how the brain works. And along the way, as Ahmed had alluded to, we'll have little numerical exercises that I had uploaded on GitHub. You can download them and play with them a little bit too to get a sense of what these equations are like and what their processes are like. Right, so let's jump in. Yeah, as Ahmed had said, I just started my new job at the University of Delaware. It's in a small, essentially suburb of Philadelphia. This is where my office is, right on the green. Our animal facility is the big building right behind it. I work in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. We have a great interdisciplinary neuroscience PhD program. If you want to consider doing a PhD in the United States, I should advertise this here too. It's a great school. My background is in physics. I went here to exactly this summer school in 2016. I then did a postdoc in experimental neuroscience, and now, as Ahmed had said, I'm a professor. And to show you how little the world has changed, this is the same auditorium, 2016. And you can see me somewhere in the background. I'm the guy with the fuzzy hair here. And some of the folks who went to the summer school in 2016 are still very, very good friends of mine. We traveled all over the world, but we kept in touch. So chat with the folks to your left and to your right. You're going to make friends for the next 10 years. It's a fantastic event. Okay, plan for today. In the first lecture, we'll talk about orientation selectivity and a mathematical framework to explain and model it. We'll do some analytics to get an understanding of what these models are like. And then we will do some numerical exercises. We'll have our break, and then we play the same game, slightly advanced. We will have coupled maps, interacting fields, more complicated symmetries, and we'll use that for a new understanding of how swiftly evolution can rewire brains, specifically in primates. Okay, orientation selectivity. Oh yeah, and as I said, much of the first part of the talk is work that came out essentially of Fred Wolf's lab. So he gets the first picture here. But many other people have contributed to this effort too, all over the world. And I want to highlight our local collaborators, but three previous generations of students, Matthias Kaschube, who is now a professor at the University of Frankfurt, Wolfgang Keil, who works at the Institut Curie in Paris, and Joscha Liedtke, who was a recent PhD student. These three guys taught me almost everything I know about orientation maps. So I want to pay due credit. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. Okay, orientation selectivity. Who of you knows what orientation selectivity is? We have one, and you don't count because you know you work at PNI. Okay, orientation selectivity is one, again, in my humble opinion, one of the most remarkable phenomena in the brain of complex animals in how they process visual scenes, in particular in primates. It was discovered many years ago. You can see the reference here to 1959. This was one of the first publications that mentioned it. If you have a screen with a grating-like stimulus, and you make a, back in the days, cat observe this kind of stimulus, and you record the electrical activity of neurons in its visual cortex. That is the part of the brain that receives visual information. The neurons there produce action potentials, these brief pulses of electrical activity. It's kind of a unit of how neurons become active. And it turns out quite remarkably that the activity of these neurons is strongly modulated depending on the orientation of these elongated stimuli. So here you can see that this one cell seems to prefer a vertical stimulus over horizontal. And this phenomenon is called orientation selectivity because that's what these neurons are. They are selective to a particular visual orientation. More recent work has looked into their spatial arrangement with technology, mostly imaging, the kind of work I do in my lab nowadays too. And they have discovered quite remarkably that there's a intriguing organization of orientation selectivity in the visual cortex. Oh yeah, I will just show this if my sound works. So we'll skip this. You can check that out yourself in the break. There's a David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel got the Nobel Prize for this discovery. And in their Nobel Prize lecture, they show a few examples of what the raw data was like, how they had these elongated bright bars and presented them to animals where you can listen to these discharges of electrical activity. And you can see how they rotate these stimuli and the neurons become quiescent, and then they align it again and the neurons become active. It's really striking. Okay, but to their spatial arrangement. Now if we do imaging in these brains, we find that many neurons are orientation selective. The little number here is depth in the brain. So we do optical slices. We go down in depth from the surface of the brain about 1/4 of a millimeter down. Every dot is a neuron, so a nerve cell. And color-coded here is its preferred orientation. So all the guys who are colored yellow prefer an angle of around 45 degrees on that computer screen. And all the cells that are in blue prefer 135 degrees. Orthogonal to it. The thing you will appreciate here is that there is an enormous number of orientation selective cells, so these guys are not rare at all, and they have these intriguing properties. There are singular points around all of the preferred orientations are arranged radially. You can already guess that if you have a physics experiment, this is exciting because this is a topological property. If you were to manipulate this arrangement of preferred orientations, this point defect still exists. It has to move around, it can't just disappear, because these orientations don't allow that. The word for this object is called a pinwheel, because it looks a little bit like a pinwheel. We have all the colors arranged around it radially. Here's a different example from a different animal, and you can see essentially the same structure. You have these pinwheels around which all the preferred orientations are arranged radially. Other techniques that allow to record from much larger parts of the brain have revealed the long-range organization of orientation selectivity. And here I want to show you an example data set from a different creature, a tree shrew. And this is now done with wide field imaging. This is our friend, the tree shrew. And then we observe maps like this. This is the raw data, and you can process it mildly. And then you find that there are these remarkable patterns. There are groups of neurons where all of these cells here, colored in red, prefer horizontal stimuli. And all the neurons here in these greenish regions prefer 45 degrees. And you can already see that this is quite an extraordinary structure that happens to exist in the brains of many different creatures, cats and tree shrews, for example. So what are the key features of this layout? One, we just mentioned, the pinwheels, but there are a few more. I want to chat just a little bit more about how these techniques actually work, because that is the data that we will work with in a minute. So say you have your animal, and your computer screen, you present a certain stimulus, and you measure the large-scale activity on the surface of the brain with an optical imaging technique. In this case, it's called intrinsic signal. And then you get these like patterned activations. The dark spots are the regions where the brain is particularly active for this kind of stimulus. Then you take a different stimulus, and you get a different pattern of electrical activity. And then based on these different stimulus sets, you can compute a map of the preferred orientations. And now and for the rest of the talk, I will always color code them with this HSV color scheme. And in it, you can find the little pinwheels. So that is important feature number one. Oh yeah, and this data set comes from a macaque monkey. I'll try to show in the introduction examples from various species to illustrate how seemingly common this phenomenon is. All right, so we have two pinwheels here. The second important feature is that there's a typical scale. You can almost guess it from what this looks like in the background. To go from one of these green domains where the neurons prefer horizontal to the next green domain, the distance is about 1 millimeter. You can see that there aren't really fluctuations on a much smaller scale, nor are there fluctuations on a much larger scale. And the word for that is it's dominated by a typical spatial frequency, although there are variations in the layout. Okay, so in the physics world, to find a typical scale, what you do is you take the Fourier transform of your pattern, and then it turns out if you look at the Fourier transform, it looks roughly like a ring. The colors here are the phases, so you can ignore that for now. But you can see all the spectral power is contained on a ring-like structure, and that spatial frequency dominates the patterns. The second thing you can see is they're kind of isotropic. They're pretty round, so there's not a certain bias in a particular spatial direction. There's uniform spectral power confined to a typical frequency. And again, the left is an example from a macaque monkey, and on the right is another fantastic animal, the galago. If we take the the angular average of our power spectra, we get these curves that show that across all of these different species, we have a typical spatial frequency that dominate these layouts of orientation domains. Okay, and then one thing I want to highlight briefly, if we just draw two circles of the same size, you can see that in this region, there seems to be much less variation of these preferred orientations compared to this region. So there are anisotropies here. Part of these maps have a longer wavelength or a shorter wavelength, and this gives rise to the width of the Fourier spectrum. If the entire map had exactly the same spatial frequency content, then the ring would just be a delta distribution on this circle. But the width is differences in preferred spatial frequencies across the layout. Okay. Oh yeah, that's the galago, another fantastic creature. To get at these spatial variations, one can compute the local spacing with a wavelet-based technique to give you an intuition of this work. Say you want to know what the typical spacing of that pattern is on the red dot. What you do is you multiply the pattern with a Gabor wavelet of a certain size. So a Gabor wavelet, to remind you, is the product of a Gaussian envelope with a plane wave. It's really just that. E to the I k x, e to the minus x squared. So it falls off, but is modulated by a wave. And it has this wavelength or frequency parameter that tunes how many of these modulations you have in a wave of a certain size. And we can change the size here, but we always compute a dot product. And here you can already see that the pattern doesn't really change on the scale of the wavelet, so the dot product of both is very small. The wavelength coefficient is small. If you make our wavelet a little bit bigger, we see that it starts to approach the typical scale of the fluctuations of the underlying field. Then the dot product becomes larger. But if our wavelet is too big, then we start to average within these subregions, and then the coefficients become smaller again. Then that allows us, by computing wavelet coefficients for the entire field, to get an estimate of the local wavelength or the local spatial scale of these patterns. And with that, we can quantify the properties of these earlier mentioned topological defects, the pinwheels. So here in this box of 1 lambda squared, the intrinsic spatial scale, we have 3 of them. We can play the same game in a different region of this map. Wavelets of different sizes. We get our box, we count the number of pinwheels, and in this case, it's 4. Okay. So this is where I want to stop talking about the phenomenology of orientation maps and switch gears a little bit to talk about how to cast these observations into a mathematical language that we can use to better understand the properties of these patterns and how they emerge over time. So for the next couple slides, we'll focus a little bit more on math, and then we go back to the experiment and how they're both linked. A very elegant way to capture orientation selectivity in an object that we all know how to deal with very, very well is to express them as complex numbers. That is an idea that goes back to Swindale. So if you have it's called a tuning curve. It's the firing rate, so number of these pulses as a function of orientation. These neurons have a preferred orientation where the firing rate is highest, and a tuning strength. It's kind of the modulation of how much the firing rate differ from the preferred orientation to the not preferred orientations. So there are 2 things that we want to capture here: a preferred angular variable and an amplitude for orientation selectivity. And now we can do something very clever and combine both into a complex number. And in the complex number, we capture the preferred orientation with the phase and the amplitude as the strength of orientation selectivity. Again, this is an idea that goes back to Swindale. Here I just copy-pasted that snippet from his paper. But that allows us to take these patterns and now describe them as a complex field. So they aren't really neurons anymore. There is only local orientation preference and local orientation selectivity, the strength of orientation preference. All right, and now and for the remainder of the talks, I will refer to this complex field as Z. Now, we want to develop a theory for our complex field, and in the physics world, we work with complex fields a lot. Here's an example that everybody here has worked with, Introduction to Quantum Field Theory and had to go through the Pesky and Schroeder, has worked with a quartic interaction of a complex scalar field. It's a typical example from field theory. So we want something like that that describes these fields. And so we have to do some homework. We have to figure out what the linear interactions are like, or what are the propagators of this field, what gives rise to these layouts. And the second thing we want to, or we have to figure out is what are the lowest order important nonlinear interaction. It's kind of like this phi to the 4th theory. You can see the propagator there, the linear term, and then a quartic interaction that makes it interesting. So we want to do kind of the same thing for these orientation maps. Let's start with the linear operator first. I had already mentioned that orientation maps have this property that they have a typical scale. If you look at the Fourier transform, they form these rings. So we would want a dynamical system that produces a pattern, ideally with a linear operator. So how can we do this? There's a very common technique to do this. It's called a Swift-Holmberg operator. And the guy looks like this. R is a number. Kc is the spatial frequency that is strongest when these dynamics unfold, and this is the gradient. When you look at this, or when I looked at this for the first time, I thought, what the hell does that even mean? It's like nabla to the 4th. It's like, what? Why does that form a typical scale? But it's very easy to understand what is actually happening here, because it's a linear interaction. So we can make an educated guess about what kind of functions solve dynamics of this type. So if we write down the temporal evolution of our complex field with this kind of obscure linear operator, and we make a clever guess of what the solutions might be like, namely plane waves, e to the ikx plus some temporal dependency with the time scale lambda, we see that all these derivatives here become just factors. It's a polynomial thing. And then we see that the growth rate of this guess for a solution depends on its spatial frequency k. So we can plot this guy as a function of spatial frequency. And I mean, you can kind of guess it just from the polynomial structure. For very large k, the whole thing decays like minus k to the fourth. For very small k, we end up at r minus kc squared. And at k equals kc, we have a maximum that's here at r. And just from the shape of the curve, you can already appreciate that if the spatial frequency k of our guess for a solution is close to kc, then the growth rate is largest. So if you have dynamics that unfold like this, with random initial conditions, it will pick out a spatial frequency at a particular kc and amplify that over time. The second thing that is important to realize here is that the important time scale at criticality, so say you had a pattern where k is exactly kc, then the important time scale here is r, this first parameter. Yeah, so these linear dynamics make modes of spatial frequency kc grow fastest, and it exhibits a typical intrinsic time scale that's 1 over r. Okay, that's the linear dynamics. Now, what about the interactions? Our goal is to find an equation that governs orientation maps, so something of that form. Change of this complex field over time is some nonlinear function of the complex field. Now, of course, that is hopeless, right? How could we possibly come up with an equation that models development of the entire brain? It's not possible. But if you put on your physics hat, there's a very clever trick around it. The first thing you should do is, when you have a big problem, is let's just Taylor approximate it. Let's figure out what the leading order contributions are, and ideally stop at 3, because everything beyond that is hard anyway. Okay, so we have 3 terms. Now, it's still pretty bad, because there are a lot of conceivable 3-point interactions here. Important trick number 2 in the physics world is we use symmetries. We know that these orientation preference maps should be ideally translationally symmetric. So whatever operator we have here, we don't want to give it an explicit dependency on spatial position. We also want this operator to be rotation invariant. There shouldn't be any bias towards a particular orientation in the brain. We want it invariant under global phase shift. So if we rotate all the orientations by a particular angle, we still want the same dynamics. And we want the third order interaction to be permutation symmetric, so the position of the different z's doesn't really matter. That constrains the interactions significantly, and essentially only leaves a handful of third order z interactions, but they can still conceivably exist either local or non-local. And so a local term, that's easy, that's a term of this form, it's essentially z cubed, and it only contributes at a position x, governing the dynamics of z of x. You can also have a term that is non-local, so you have different z's that interact with one another with some interaction kernel. Of course, that's going to be hard to figure out in general too, but we can make an educated guess here that these interactions, because they are neurons that are wired with one another, will probably decay in space with some decay scale. So we can model this as a normal distribution or a Gaussian of sorts. And we want this decay to exist both in distance in space, in millimeters, and difference in orientation selectivity. So we can make our guess here, Gaussian decay with some length scale sigma. Of course, now we have a whole bunch of powers of z that contribute to the non-local term. So we expand this to third order, as I had already alluded to. And then we end up with this nonlinearity that captures this trade-off between local and non-local interactions and preserves the symmetries that I had mentioned. There's one additional simplification that we have made here. We have added a parameter g, and this g allows us to tweak between the contributions of the local term and the non-local term. So if g equals 1, this guy is irrelevant, and we only have non-local interactions. If G is 2, this guy is 0, and we only have local interactions. So we can kind of explore this trade-off between local versus non-local computations. Okay, so we now have one derivation of a potential candidate that could govern the dynamics of these fields by choosing a suitable linear kernel to produce a typical scale and an interaction based on symmetries. There's a second derivation of essentially the same equation that I want to show just briefly that is built on an optimization principle. It will produce exactly the same result. You could also try to come up with dynamics that are variational in nature. You want to optimize something. So the Z's are the solution of some sort of energy landscape, and you do gradient descent here. So you start at some random Z and you walk into the local minima. So what is E? Well, it should have the same properties as the function that we described previously. First, we want a typical scale. And if you have a quartic interaction with this kind of coupling, that will produce Swift-Holmberg dynamics. If you want to do your homework and compute the derivatives in Z, I mean, it's almost obvious you would get a Swift-Holmberg kernel. Second, you want a solution where Z has a typical expected value. You don't want it all to decay down to 0. It's kind of like a Higgs mechanism for a non-quantized field. So if you have a term like this and you choose your U and your R suitably, then your optimal solutions will have a finite amplitude. And the third key contribution is we want maximum diversity of these patterns. So we compute the product of the preferred orientation at X and Y and just average this with some sort of interaction kernel. And if you choose a Gaussian interaction kernel, you get exactly the same equation that we had seen previously. Right, so here is the model in all its scary glory. The red part, again, is the linear kernel that produces the typical spatial scale. The green stuff are local interactions. They only depend on X, so where you are trying to describe the dynamics. And then the blue stuff are the non-local interactions. And I also added the energy terms here, so you can kind of visually appreciate where these different terms come from. Right. The reason why I did both is because sometimes the derivation as a dynamical system can be a little bit misleading. It helped me to think about this problem as a vast configuration space of possible complex layouts with these minima that exist somewhere in this complicated space. And our job now is to better understand what the statistical property of these minima are. How do they depend on the choices of parameters? Are there degeneracies? Can we make statements about their stability and so forth? So for me, this energy perspective has always been a little bit more helpful than just looking at the dynamical equations. But when we do numerics in a little bit, then we will just simulate this full partial integral differential equation and confirm that our analytics align with what we see in our computer. Okay. Oh yeah, and there's a third derivation that you can do based on the conic term that was published by Matthias Kaschuba in his science paper in 2010. Yeah. Who is intimidated by this equation? Yeah, I'm too. Who here has an idea of how to analyze an equation like this? If you have a pattern-forming system with complicated nonlinear interactions, how do you analyze that? Ah, so you are learning something new. That's great. Sometimes everybody knows that. If you have had a class on turbulence or pattern formation, you will have learned weakly nonlinear analysis. That's what we're going to do here too. And this allows to map what systems of this type generally do. Sounds fancy, but the idea is actually very simple. It's much simpler than Lagrangian mechanics. The idea is, oh yeah, let's do a brief summary first. I'm a little bit tired, so I forgot the order of my slides here. So we want to develop an intuition about our model. We do that analytically. Importantly, the dynamics are gradient descent. You had seen this. It's not a variational thing. It's not a Lagrangian here. So we walk into these local minima, and then we get stuck. So what are we descending into? What are the optima of the system? Can we compute them? And if we can we make sure that they are maxima or minima? Are they actually attractors or unstable points? Or maybe saddles? And that will help us to develop an intuition about the attractor landscape. And yeah, along the way, you will learn how to analyze pattern-forming systems because they are a little bit different to what you might have learned in a in a field theory class. Okay, so we had already seen from our consideration for the linear interactions that all the important dynamics essentially work on this critical circle. So we can make a guess that solutions will be roughly of this type. Our complex field is composed of a set of plane waves with different wave vectors, kc, that point in different directions. It can be anywhere on the circle, but they all share the same spatial frequency. So if you think about the Fourier spectrum of this thing, it's like a set of delta peaks all on the same ring. This ring is produced by our linear interactions, and now the nonlinear interactions will make these modes chat with one another. They will lead to effective interactions on this circle. It's relatively easy to see if you plug in this form of Z into our dynamical equation. You transform the whole thing from these crazy complicated partial integral differential equations into a set of simple coupled or ordinary differential equations for the amplitudes. So all of this scary complexity kind of goes away because we constrain the dynamics to exist only on the critical circle. And then we can think about ODEs, and those are much simpler. We can look at fixed points. So whenever we start, do we have a solution for A that is kind of finite, or do they all decay down to 0? We can add perturbations. And the only thing that we have to do is to make sense here is we have to figure out what these coefficients are, the G's and the F's, and do some algebra with simple ordinary differential equations. Yeah, it turns out that for the model that I just described, that these coefficients G and F only depend on the angle between the modes, so the angles between two different k vectors. And I will show you the result just briefly. Let's ignore that for now. Because I won't go in the details any further, but you see here that the G and the F's constrain how these modes talk to one another depending on how far away they are from one another on the critical circle. In practice, when we analyze models for orientation preference maps, we almost always simulate these amplitude equations and not the full model because they are much easier to simulate and much easier to control. You can get a handle of how good your numerics are. You can use higher order solvers. It's a lot more controlled than trying to figure out how to solve these extremely complicated partial differential equations in their full glory. Okay. So this analysis leads to a solution candidate that we call essentially complex planforms. They are sums of plane waves at the same spatial frequency, kc, but different directions. And here we add this additional factor L, which is either +1 or -1, so that the wave vector can point either up or down. But only one of the two is occupied. And because it's only one, fields of that sort can never be real. Because if you remember, a cosine is e to the ikx plus e to the minus ikx. So if you have two modes on opposite ends of the critical circle, you can get real valued solutions. We don't want that. And if we write it down like that, with the j's being either -1 or +1, we have complex solutions that have to be complex. And therefore, the name for them is essentially complex planforms. It's a particular subset of superpositions of plane waves. For essentially complex planforms, and oh yeah, that's what I just mentioned. And our model, yeah, of course. Let's start here with the examples. Let me show you one. If you, I'll go here too. I have the code for this uploaded on GitHub. You can download it there too. This is MATLAB code. You can just clone the entire repo. There are a couple of .m files that will do these different simulations. The first, you know how to clone something from GitHub? Let me show you. Okay, so you go to, that's me on GitHub, and then I have this teaching code repository. It has a whole lot of stuff in it, because I don't just talk about orientation maps. And you can just click it and download the whole thing as zip if you don't like terminals. So we do that. So it'll take a little while. And then we can go to the code. Okay, this is now the code, and there's a folder here called orientation maps. And we will start to execute code from here. Okay, let me restart MATLAB so that you see the process here. Okay, this is now my downloads folder. Teaching code main, orientation maps. Okay, and there's this function called make ECP that is producing an essentially complex plan form. There's a function here where the exciting stuff is essentially just this loop here where we sum up a whole bunch of plane waves. You can see e to the I k L times various angles phi that come from the full set of available angles. And then we can look at it. So here we take a ECP that has 18 modes on the critical circle. So there are 18 entries on this circle that end up in the sum. We make these L values random, so they can point either up or either down, doesn't matter. And the phases of all of these contributing plane waves are also random. Okay, then we produce our complex field. We count the pinwheels. You'll see it in the plot later. And then we just look at the phase here. We run this guy. It won't take a second. We get our first essentially complex plan form. So already visually you can see it has a certain similarity to these patterns that we had seen in the brain. If we zoom in a little bit, you see all these black dots. These are the pinwheels. The points around all these orientations are arranged radially. The algorithm that finds them is actually pretty simple. It just finds roots of the complex field. So the only way how you can build a pinwheel like that is you have a root of the absolute value. So this very point isn't orientation selective, but around it you can have all the possible preferred orientations. So if you add a root finder, you can find all these little black dots that mark the pinwheels. Okay, so this is what an ECP looks like. Second thing I want to show you too is if you have fewer modes that contribute to the ECP, let's do 3, then the patterns are a lot more regular, which isn't too surprising, because if you only have like 3 modes on the circle, then there are only a handful of possible arrangements conceivable. And the more modes you have, the richer these patterns become. And importantly, they also become aperiodic. They will never repeat themselves ever again. Whereas for a small number of modes, like this guy, you essentially end up with crystals. So patterns that have a spatial periodicity in them. Right here. So these are ECPs. From now on, we'll do, you can scan the QR code too if you want to. I will have example code for all the plots and all the videos that I show in the rest of the talk, so you can follow along too if you want to. Just the videos might take a little bit long to compute, so you might want to do that overnight or something. But the code is all there. Right, so if you can just execute make ECP, you'll get your first ECP. You can start to play with it. In the numeric section, so a little bit later, we will do the full integration of the model. But let's skip that for now, because that is a larger bite to chew. Yeah, and I had already mentioned this in practice. We integrate amplitude equations, which are just polynomial, nonlinear, ordinary differential equations for the dynamics, which are much, much easier to simulate and to control than the full dynamics of these models. That said, it is endlessly entertaining trying to come up with better solvers for these extremely complicated partial differential equations. So I chatted with a shared friend of ours, Rainer, about this like 2 days ago, and he told me like, you shouldn't use MATLAB. That software sucks. Write it in Julia. So I've also uploaded his Julia code, which he sent to me while I was sitting on the airplane. So you can now also simulate orientation maps in Julia, which is in the same repository. I haven't tried it though. So it might fail. If it fails, send him an email and let him know that his Julia code isn't great. Okay. I hope he's online and heard that. Okay. Oh yeah, that is the picture that we just saw of this example orientation map with 18 modes on the critical circle. The other thing that I want to mention here briefly, and it's just heuristically, if you compute or count the number of pinwheels or these local routes per unit area, so like a lambda squared, that is a little number that I wrote over this ECP. And you can already see that 3.12 is suspiciously close to a well-known mathematical constant. And this will become more important as we progress in the talk. Right. Yes. Okay, now let's talk about why ECPs are so exciting. They're actually solutions of these complicated dynamics that we talked about earlier. For ECPs, the Fij, that is the second interactions in the amplitude equation, vanishes. It's just 0. So their dynamics for all of these contributing amplitudes are given just by that much, much simpler equation. And you can see this is independent for all the different i's. So we can write down the stationary solutions. So if we know these angle-dependent interaction functions, we can compute that an ECP with these amplitudes is a fixed point. This is where A dot is 0. So we found our first solutions. Now we just have to figure out whether these solutions are not just intrinsically stable, so they don't decay under the dynamics of the model itself, but also stable under additional perturbations. Oh yeah, and you can compute the energy through this energy approximation, and then you get a certain number too. To assess external stability, we add a test mode with amplitude B to our previous solution. And now we compute a new set of amplitude equations that incorporates B, which is not particularly complicated. It's just a little bit of algebra. And then we get an ordinary differential equation that now has this B term in it. And now to make sure that our ECP is stable to this test mode or this test perturbation, you have to make sure that the coefficient here is negative for all possible angles. So irrespective of where you pop on this test mode on the critical circle, you want to make sure that it decays down to 0. And that will, in general, depend on the parameters of our model. So certain ECPs will be stable, others might not. So we have to do a little bit more math to figure that out. But that is the important equation for it. We found fixed points of our dynamics, and we found an equation that describes their stability, depending on model parameters. And then we can draw this as a cartoon to get an overview of the solution space. And here I took a few older plots in black and white because I want to mention Fred wrote a chapter about the theory of orientation maps. That's the reference down here on the screen. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into the underlying mathematical structures, you can check out that chapter. It's a fantastic resource and very well condensed into the essence of what matters to make sense of these patterns. Right. And we find that depending on the scale of interaction, sigma, and this G coupling that tunes between local and non-local parameters, we find a large chunk of the space in which simple plane waves, just a single mode on the critical circle, is a stable solution that is also stable under external perturbations. So if we simulate sigma is 0.1 and G is 1.5 with random initial conditions, we will converge two plane waves. Down here, more exciting things are happening. In fact, we can take a particular ECP. This is one with 5 modes on the critical circle, and we find a regime that's the all gray shaded areas in which this 5 ECP is stable against external perturbations. And there is a second region here that's the light shaded part, whereas the dark shaded part, where the 5 ECP is not the ECP with the lowest energy, or it is the ECP with the lowest energy. So only in this dark shaded area is this guy stable and the lowest energy solution. In these gray parts, still stable, but not the lowest energy ECP. And so when you start to do numerical simulations and start with random initial conditions, you might end up in some solution. Out here in these light shaded areas, you can end up with a 5 ECP because that is still a local minima, even though it's not the best solution. If you plot all the ECPs, then you find that there's this region down here in this parameter space where the longer the interactions are, the more modes can be stable on the critical circle. So the more complicated these patterns become, the more rich they become. And that is only possible when you have truly long-range interactions. Okay, what's the intuition about how the solution space now looks like? And here I'll use a cartoon from Yosha, another PhD student who worked on this. He called it the Toryverse, and I thought that was a particularly elegant way of phrasing it. So we have this extremely high-dimensional solution space of all possible complex patterns. And in it, we have these n-dimensional tori. And they're not really tori like that. They're composed of these 5, 6, 8 modes on the critical circle. They're all phase degenerate. So every contributing phase gives you a 2 pi degree of freedom. So the entire family of 5 ECPs sits on like one of these donuts. And a different 5 ECP, one of the modes is flipped as a different donut. So in this high dimensional space, we have a like dotted like little stars on the sky, these solution donuts that are all phase degenerate and have the same energies. But there's still distinct patterns in which the preferred orientations would look different when arranged in space. Okay, so just based on theoretical consideration, we got a relatively good idea about what this model should do in practice. Oh, yeah, I should mention this too. We can also compute the pinwheel density in closed form for it, so the number of roots per unit area. I won't go through all the math here, but just to give you a sense of how this is done, you can literally count the roots of the complex field. So you compute the integral over the entire area, and every delta gives you a 1 whenever you have a root of the complex field, and the Jacobian just makes sure that you don't mess up your area measurements. The Jacobian is composed of the real and imaginary part of this complex field, and that can be modeled as a multivariate Gaussian distribution, where all of these factors play a role. But what is important here is they're all just local. So we can compute the derivatives and the real and imaginary parts just from these plane waves and get the density of these defects. It turns out that the density is in fact pi in the limit of long-range interactions and conditioning on the anisotropy of these ECPs. So that is the sum of L times K. So if all the wave vectors go in the same direction, that means your pinwheel density is typically lower because your pattern is still going to be a little bit wavy in a particular direction. If your L's are all kind of random, then the anisotropy is small and your pinwheel density is going to be much closer to pi. Right, so if the number of modes increase, you get closer and closer to 3.14. Oh yeah, fun side note, who of you have heard of humanities last exam? You're my man. There's you might have seen it in the New York Times or something. It's supposed to be an exam where people with singular interests ask questions that are very hard to solve for large language models. And you can propose new questions to their website. And the criteria are the question should be hard, like really hard. And the solutions should ideally be a single number or a single word, something that's conceptually simple. So it really lends itself to mathematical problems, where you have something that really makes your brain hurt a little bit. But as a human thinker, you can reason your way through and come to a conclusion. But these LLMs are spectacularly bad at it. And so one of the problems here is in this family of ECPs, if you only have one mode, well, then there's only one ECP if you remove like angular degrees of freedom. With 2 modes, there's also just one, this 90-degree angle, because again, they can't be on opposite sides of the critical circle, because that would be a real value solution. For 3 modes, we have 2 possibilities. In our world of pinwheelists, we call this the hedgehog solution, and that's the Mercedes solution, because it looks like a Mercedes star, like the hedgehog with the 3 points to the same side. And then you can start to wonder how many exist for a certain number of modes on the critical circle. And I will leave this to an exercise at home. But long story short, the large language models can't figure that out. So here's the same thing asked as a question. Consider 2-dimensional complex fields that are defined just as we had just learned as ECPs. Their number becomes large. But how many unique ECPs exist for large numbers of modes n? Okay, that was enough fun with the analytics. Now let's do a little bit of numerics. How do we solve equations of this type in practice? There are different ways how to do it. Some methods are easier, some are harder. And there's Reiner's method, which I haven't even seen yet. In the MATLAB code, it's a relatively simple solution for this. So the first thing you have to solve is somehow make sense of this linear operator. It turns out that it's a pretty stiff problem. And if you have a stiff problem, how do you integrate that? Well, implicit solvers. So two different ways to solve differential equations, implicit or explicit. Depends on where you get your time dependency from, either from t+1 or from t. There are also hybrid schemes where you kind of average the two, like the Nicholson scheme. To address this, the solver that I gave you in MATLAB is an implicit solver. So we rewrite our time derivative like, well, the time derivative. And because it's an implicit solver, we take z of t plus dt on the right-hand side, not just z of t. Then we shuffle these terms around a little bit. And we get an equation here that, well, first in Fourier space, much simpler. It's just a polynomial. That's easier. And then we shuffle it around. And we get this very simple expression for how to do a time step in Fourier space. So we take our map, we Fourier transform it, we have it in K space. We multiply it with this update rule. We do an inverse transformation, and we have the field at the next time step. So the linear parts here are relatively easy to do. For the nonlinear parts, because they have these complicated special dependencies, it's often easier to add those in normal space, so without any Fourier transformations. Right. If you want to come up with more elegant ways, there's a paper on it by Lars Reichel. But it's going to work for today, and it will produce the right solutions for the model that we are looking at. It's fast enough to run, and it's pretty transparent in what's happening. So let's look at one, and let's start with the g equals 2 case. You can see it's about 75 lines of code, and half of it is just for plotting. And the exciting stuff happens. Well, these are the parameters, the number of hypercolumns, the number of pixels in our solutions, the time steps. This is Swift-Holmberg kernel from this implicit solving scheme that we just seen. So 1 divided by 1 minus dt times the rest of this polynomial in K. And then we have our for loop. And we solve it by first computing the Fourier transform of our current complex field. So here's FFT2 for Z map. That gives us the spectral representation. Then we multiply this with our kernel in Fourier space and compute the inverse Fourier transform. That gives us the time update of our field. And then we add to this the interactions that we're interested in. Again, for g equals 2, we don't have non-local interactions. It's really just the local term. So rather than 1 minus g, we could also just write minus this guy here. So that is the simplest third order interaction that's going to do something exciting. And then we can run this. And the initial conditions here are random complex numbers with a small amplitude. Let's produce an output every plot here. Okay, so let's run this. And the first thing you'll notice is we started random initial conditions, and then the dynamics will constrain the amplitudes closer and closer to the critical circle. So the ring, it's happening very slowly, but it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower because only the modes at KC survive the dynamics. That's the first important phase of the dynamics of this model. Once we have selected a set of modes on the critical circle, then this inter-mode interactions start to play an important role, and they start to kick one another around, or some modes die off and others get added to the dynamics. If we let this run for a little while, I won't do it live here. I guess we could let it run in the background. For g equals 2, this should converge to stripes. So I can just let this run in the background, and hopefully in 10 minutes we're going to see a stripy solution. Back to MATLAB. Right, and then when it's done, we'll also run the non-local version of the same code, and that will produce an ECP-style solution in which it converges. Okay. I brought a few videos just in case this takes too long. This is the same random seed that you have just seen in the other window, but now it's a video. So I saved a picture every iteration and just made it into a little movie. Random initial conditions, so random phases, random color noise, and this is the spectrum, which is also just white noise. Then the dynamic starts, and immediately the high frequency and low frequency modes disappear, and our dynamic is constrained to the critical circle. And then it starts to narrow down, and then you see how, in this case, only these two modes survive, but the dynamics become painfully slow, actually logarithmically slow. You can see that there's like a defect line here with a couple pinwheels, and here are the matching pinwheels. To get a perfectly striped solution, they have to annihilate. So they have to come close to one another to get rid of this defect. And they do. They move there very slowly, but you can see it's really, really slow. You can kind of see how they get closer to one another, but it's going to take ages for the simulation to produce a perfectly plain wave without any pinwheels in it. Right, but long story short, you get a wavy solution. If we do exactly the same initial conditions, exactly the same dynamics, but now with long-range interactions of some scale, then the first part of the dynamics looks exactly the same. You still have the selection of modes around the critical circle, but then at some point, the modes start to stabilize one another. And see how there are a few that have like large numbers. They survive the dynamics, and a lot of other modes just die out. And the solutions that you converge to after running this for a little while are our ECP-style solutions. Here you can already see that it really just is a handful of modes that survive the dynamics on the critical circle, and these are the stable solutions for these kinds of dynamics. Right. Let's see what our simulation in the background's doing. Well, still pretty far away. Right. So if we go back to the pinwheel density, our observable without long-range interactions, all the pinwheels die away. We have plain wavy solutions. There are no roots, so pinwheel density is very close to 0. With long-range interactions, the pinwheel density is finite, and actually around pi, 3.14. I want to briefly mention, it's another side note here, that you can also construct maximum entropy models for maps. If you start with random phases and you just constrain their pairwise interactions so that you have a typical spatial frequency, you can construct an ensemble of random waves that have similar statistical properties. In fact, in the limit of an extremely narrow power spectrum, so just stuff on the critical circle, you also get pi. But for any power spectrum that's larger, or for a beta value that's small, the pinwheel density is always larger than pi. So if you have just a random solution, you don't really get these 3.14 style solutions. The other reason why I mentioned this is the project that I did at the summer school 9 years ago was to construct maximum entropy models for orientation maps with quartic interactions, which is a little bit fiddly. It's kind of these maximum entropy style model with like JIJ interactions where you have to be clever about how you come up with the JIJ so that you get the right statistics out. Right. We can also simulate. I'll continue running this over the break. I want to show you a random ECP first, because those are also very, very pretty. So random maps, again, it's just a function, create OPM. And the exciting stuff happens here. That's the power spectrum. So it is this k to the coefficient beta times e to the safe times Gaussian decay. Oh, that's on this computer. Okay. Right, so we multiply our target power spectrum with random numbers, random complex numbers, do the whole business in the Fourier domain, inverse transformation, we get our field back. So for large values of beta, we get solutions that are very close to our ECPs. You can see they look qualitatively similar, but for smaller values of beta, the patterns become pretty irregular. You can see it here. It doesn't really look like what we had seen in brains before, because now we have these relatively large regions that have similar preferred orientations. And for patterns like this, the pinwheel density is much, much larger, as one can compute in closed form. It was fun to do this at the summer school, but I also want to mention this is an example case of an alternative model class for orientation maps that makes strikingly different predictions about the pinwheel density that one should find in them. Yeah, we had seen the example. And here's actually a little spectrum for different predictions for pinwheel densities for different types of models. We have talked about this long-range interaction model, the analytics and numerics, and a few papers that came out of it. I showed one example of like random, just pairwise constrained complex fields that produce pinwheel density that's too high. There's another specific model that I worked on during my PhD that is producing hexagonal crystals. They look like this. They also have a pinwheel density that's too high. So the pinwheel density is a really sensitive readout parameter to constrain the model classes that could explain the dynamics in the brain. Okay, so far we learned about orientation selectivity with these two key features, a typical scale and the existence of pinwheels in the complex fields. We developed a model. We did some analytical exploration to get a sense of how to handle problems of that sort. And then we did a little bit of numerics to validate our analytical insights with actual simulations. And now we have like the 25-minute left for discussion. You can start to play with the code if you want to. But also, we have uploaded all orientation maps that we worked on in the past in a publicly available data set. So you can download these orientation maps and play with them yourself. Again, they're just two-dimensional fields of complex numbers, and you can do all kinds of observations with them. Compute pinwheel densities, but also other things like 3-point pinwheels distance correlations, which I've never looked at. Maybe that's interesting too. So it's a pretty big data set that is now available for the public. Right, we went through that earlier, so to play with the code, make ECP makes an essentially complex plant form, random maps makes a random map, and these two simulate the model either for local interactions or for non-local interactions. And coupled maps, we'll talk about that a little bit later today. And I want to show you the code for G098 for an example non-local interaction. So for the non-local interactions, again, we had the linear part happens with this implicit pseudospectral scheme. That's the same. But for the nonlinear part, we have Gaussian interactions that fall off with some length scale, S. And when we do our update steps, we now have our updated Z is our linear change in Z plus the local terms plus the non-local terms. The local terms is just Z cubed. And the non-local terms have these two contributions that are fastest to implement if you do that in Fourier space too. Because remember, they're convolutions where Z of X and Z of Y chat with one another based on this Gaussian interaction. And convolutions become diagonal in Fourier space. So if you take the Fourier transform, you can just multiply the fields, take the inverse Fourier transform, and then it runs much faster. Yeah, so we can just run this here too. And it look very, very similar. And the initial dynamics are actually the same. Why don't we get an output here? Oh yeah, let's make an output always. Yeah, the initial dynamics are again the same. We select modes on the critical circle, becomes tighter and tighter and tighter, and then the intermode interactions start kicking in and they stabilize these complex patterns. Now we can let that run in the background. Okay, and that's all I wanted to talk about for the first hour. So now we can play with the numerics. Or if you have questions.
First let's take questions for the lecture and then play around with the code. So questions first. Okay, let's begin.
Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. My question is pretty naive. These layouts in vivo, they are results, they are emergent properties, complex behavior from units like neurons, or are they programmed in genome, or likewise?
I think it's a very deep question. Nobody really knows. There is some more recent work that shows that the scaffolds of these orientation maps that you can observe after eye opening. So first of all, the animals need open eyes to measure them. Otherwise, they couldn't look at the screen. But in very young animals, you can look at spontaneous neural activity in the developing brain while the eyes are still closed. So there are no sensory inputs that make it into visual cortex, but there's already electrical activity that is patterned in a particular way. And based on the correlation structure of these patterns, you can predict the orientation map that the animals will exhibit after eye opening. So it feels as if there's some scaffolding mechanism that happens before eye opening that changes the circuit in a particular way so that when the animals open their eyes, all these circuits are ready to process the visual world in that particular way. Now, how these spontaneous activity patterns come to be, they also smell like a Turing mechanism. So there are some sort of interactions have to occur between them, otherwise you wouldn't get typical spatial scales. But how much of that is genetic or wiring specificity is, I think, unknown. And there's the third point. We'll talk about this a little bit in the second part. Many mammals have orientation preference maps with a pinwheel density super close to pi, but there are mammals who don't. An example are mice. Neurons in their visual cortices are also orientation selective, so they have the same tuning curves, but neighboring neurons can have very different preferred orientations. So if you zoom into that pattern with a microscope, sometimes it's called a salt and pepper pattern because it looks so disorganized. So there seems to be at least in these two classes, like a dichotomy of possible arrangements. And then there are a few more recent reports of some other mammals where one might be somewhere in this intermediate regime of some that is neither as disorganized as salt and pepper, nor as organized as these visual cortical maps of primates and cats and organisms like that. So that smells like there's at least a strong genetic drive to have these things in place. There has to be some sort of genetic underpinning that gives rise to these patterns. But whether it is a genetic circuit or just a program that produces patterned activity with a particular rule book, I think is still unknown.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. Is it possible to make a model-free estimation of how many modes are active from using the data?
Yes, we'll see that in part 2 today. So yes and no. It is possible because we can measure the pinwheel density in animals, and we had analytically computed the mean pinwheel density for a certain number of modes. So based on that, we can make an educated guess that we need at least 8 active modes or 9 active modes. But in the real brain, the solutions are not as monochromatic. So I showed some of the example Fourier transform of real data, and you saw that this ring has widths because it's spatially non-stationary. So there are reasons in the brain that are just a little bit, their column spacing is larger for some reason. And so that makes it a little bit difficult to say that it's exactly 5 modes or 8 modes or 10. But it can't just be 3, otherwise the pinwheel statistics wouldn't work out, or 4. So the ECPs need a certain minimum complexity to give rise to the right statistics.
And PCA is not very useful here?
Well, PCA gets confused for the same reason as Fourier transforms get confused. Like these linear transformations will just tell you that there's diversity because the patterns are non-stationary. The reasons why we use these wavelet transforms is because we have a nonlinear method that finds the correct spatial scale, and then it's an apples-to-apples comparison. So one has to do something that's slightly more complicated. These linear mixing or demixing matrices will make it seem as if there's actually spectral width, some diversity, but based on the maximum entropy models, we know that that can't quite be the case, otherwise the pinwheel density would be higher. So if we had the same like wide power spectrum, but with random phases, the pinwheel density would become larger too. So there's something interesting happening there, and it's likely related to spatial non-stationarities.
Thank you, Manuel, for the lecture. I have 2 questions, actually. The first one is, what is the effect of different initial conditions to the final pattern formation you observe? Another one is, Did you already compare our results and pattern formation brains with the community of Turing pattern formation? How brain pattern formation are related to biological system pattern formations?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I forgot your first question. Can you remind me?
Initial conditions.
Initial conditions, yeah. Let's do that first, because that's easier. The reason why I included some of the analytics today is because I think that is a better intuition of what the minima are like. Because sometimes you can have local minima that are not the best, the lowest energy state. And so if you start with random initial conditions, you're going to roll into the minimum that's closest to you. So every different initial condition might end up with a different solution. And these solutions are also degenerate. For example, phase degenerate. If you change all the preferred orientation just by 5 degrees, you get up a solution that looks visually different, like the colors are different, but it would have the same energy, and it would also be a stable fixed point. That's what I try to communicate with this Toryverse. So all of these ground states are degenerate. And if you have a different, like an epsilon different initial condition, you will likely converge on a different spot on the same torus. If your initial conditions are, the difference is larger than an epsilon, you might end up on a different torus. And you might even end up in a stable local minima that is not the global minima at that particular choice of parameters. So that's only something we can get out of the analytic treatment of the problem. Yeah. And then the second question? Oh, yeah.
How can I say if it's consistent with the Turing, the points, something like that?
Yeah, so the algebra of the Swift-Homburg equation is very abstract, and that makes it kind of powerful because it applies to all kinds of pattern-forming systems. And with my physics hat on, that is a feature, because that makes relatively universal predictions with a very small and controllable number of parameters. Some of our more biologically inclined friends might find this is disadvantageous because it removes biological detail from the problems that we're looking at. So based on the question that we had earlier, we can't really say these are genetic interactions or these are correlations that happen due to spontaneous activity, or maybe it's some chemicals that diffuse in particular ways. Because here we only need long-range interactions that stabilize these patterns. But that said, there are numerous examples of Turing instabilities in the natural world around us and pattern-forming systems in the brain. In the second part of the talk, I will talk a little bit about my more recent work. When I went from my PhD study to my postdoc, I became more interested in representation of knowledge or how reasoning and cognition work.
Give it surprise.
Yeah. We'll talk a few more patterns in that domain later. But it seems to be a theme in the brain. For some reason, brains do that. We don't really know why that's useful to them yet. The same with these orientation maps. Like, we don't really know why that is advantageous to process the visual world. It's just an empirical fact that so many different species of land-dwelling animals have them in their brains. That smells like it's important, but we don't really know what the specific benefit it is for a visual scene processing system.
Cool. So why I don't see so many laptops out, just we can play with the code with Manuel. He's available. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah,
and
let's do it.
Sure. You can manage the stage as you like.
Right. The thing with the code is it's a wee bit slow. Because to integrate that whole thing, you have to take these Fourier transforms of 512 times 512 big complex fields, and that is only 1 dt, and you have to run it for like 10,000. This is why I made the little videos to summarize the dynamics. But I want to show you a few things that we can learn about the dynamics here. Let's stop this. The first is angle Z-map. We talked a lot about the preferred orientation, so the phase map of these complex fields. In MATLAB, that is just angle. Let's use our other color map. HSV. That is a circularly periodic color map, so that works for an angle. We haven't talked yet about the actual amplitudes of that complex field. So rather than this guy, we can also just look at abs of Z. And then So this is now a pattern of the strength of orientation selectivity. So it's not circularly periodic anymore. It's now a number between 0 and some maximum. And all the spots in these hot regions are particularly orientation selective. And all the spots that are roots are our pinwheels. So these are regions where the orientation selectivity just has to go to 0 because in an epsilon neighborhood, you have all the different preferred orientations arranged radially. This is a bit harder to measure with wide field imaging experiments, so we usually don't think about orientation selectivity too much and restrict our analysis to these pinwheels. In pinwheeled world, you can make more measurements than just pinwheel density. So these are points, and any two-dimensional point process has numerous features. You can compute nearest neighbor distance distribution. So how far is it from a pinwheel around which the orientations change in a clockwise sense to the next pinwheel where the orientations change in a clockwise sense, or anti-clockwise pinwheels for that matter. So you get a whole set of different observables from these patterns, not just the pinwheel density. For the sake of time, I skipped that here. But these solutions make a whole list of predictions that one can compare to the data, not just the pinwheel density. And if you want to explore that a little bit, this pinwheel finder that you have in the tools folder, this guy, is relatively easy. It really just wants the complex field. Here it's called the map. And it returns a list of the x coordinates and the y coordinates of all the pinwheels. So we can plot that. PV x list, y list. Right, now you can see all these little circles have appeared around the pinwheels. It's actually hard to see. Well, I guess you can kind of see that there are these little circles now where oh, you can't really see that, can you? Is black better? Let's do filled. Oh, there we go. That works, right? Yeah. So now you have the list of x and y coordinates of these pinwheels. And with the list of x and y coordinates, you can compute all kinds of statistical properties of these patterns. Like what's the mean distance, what's the variance of them, are these distributions normal or are they not? And turns out they follow a particular set of rules that one can then compare to the data. Right. There's one thing I could talk about right now. Let's do that real quick too. I've talked about complex fields a lot. So we have applied this Swift-Holmberg operator and the nonlinear interactions to initial conditions that were small amplitude random complex numbers. You can do the same thing just with real numbers. Let's do that for a second. And then you get solutions that, well, are real valued. So the angle doesn't really mean anything because they're all real valued. But we can look at the solutions themselves. Now that is a bad color map for this. That is a nasty color map. I guess gray is good. Oops. Right. So this will also converge to stripes. It's just going to take a little while. The reason why I show this for a real valued field too is because in the visual cortex, orientation selectivity forms a map. But there are many other features that visual neurons care about. So the same way they have preferred orientation, many neurons in the brain have a preferred spatial frequency. Or some of them have a preferred color, like red over green, something like that. And many of these properties are organized into these two-dimensional fields too. And so it is very tempting to construct a model in which you have multiple fields, a complex one for orientation selectivity, maybe a real valued one for the preferred spatial frequency that are coupled with one another. Kind of like in field theory, how you would have a field for photons and a field for fermions, and you couple them together under the gauge symmetries. And that gives rise to interesting interactions. We will do exactly that in the second part of the talk for particular interactions between orientation selectivity and a complex and a real valued field, kind of like that, for the expression of a particular molecule in the brain called cytochrome oxidase. So there's some correlation structure there. And in this language of models, we can compute the different optima that these arrangements can have, and then compute that with the data that is available. But it's very easy to generalize this to more complicated cases of couplings. Yeah, and if you want to play with it a little bit more, I don't know whether this would work with my code, but you can also produce salt and pepper patterns. Let's make this complex again. Angle.
I never knew why you call it salt and pepper, you know.
Color, salt, and pepper.
Okay.
For ocular dominance, it actually is a black and white pattern.
Right.
Oh, that looks numerically unstable. It's not quite as simple. Conceptually, you can think about salt and pepper patterns. This was work done by another postdoc.
Do you have a picture of them?
Hmm?
Do you have a picture of salt and pepper?
Salt and pepper? No, but I'll just Google that. Salt, orientation, preference. Don't know. Yeah, I don't know that paper, but here you can kind of see what a salt and pepper pattern would look like. Every pixel has a different random orientation. And you can construct them if you choose your neighboring interactions in kind of the inverse way. So in a smooth orientation map, you want neighboring neurons to prefer similar orientation. There's kind of like a smooth covariance function that falls off with some spatial scale. For the salt and pepper pattern, you can just flip that. So you want your neighboring cells to be as dissimilar as possible. Yeah, so you can think about this like an Ising system, where you have a spin and you want its neighboring spin to be flipped. And then you get patterns that have this salt and peppery layout to them. They're also interesting to study because they have very different energetic properties. Like many glass-like systems, they have vast possible sets of ground states. And then depending on like small perturbations, they start to diffuse around, because there are so many similar states that are essentially connected. Orientation maps wouldn't do that, because every single plan form that you converge into sits at the bottom of a certain valley. And if you perturb this a little bit, we had seen this in the analytics section with that B test mode, you give it a little kick and it rolls back into the minimum. So the pattern doesn't really change that much. It's much more resilient against perturbations, whereas the salt and pepper patterns will not have this property.
So, Manuel, so if you increase the number of modes, you don't get something more similar to salt and pepper, I was thinking?
No, we can do that right now. So we can take our make ECP code. How many modes do you want? 30? Let's do 300. Actually, I don't even know what happens with 300 modes. I guess we get some averaging effect here. Let's do 30. But it can't really be. It can't really become a salt and peppery solution, because all of these modes still exist on the critical circle. So in your Fourier space, Kx and Ky, you now have modes that sit very densely on this, so this is 0, on this circle. For a salt and pepper pattern, you need higher spatial frequency contributions. Otherwise, the pattern would always be smooth. And so these ECPs will always produce smooth patterns, just because they only exist at this one spatial frequency. It's just the direction that's different. So if you take the Fourier transform of a salt and peppery pattern, you would need contributions far away from that. And the ECPs don't really produce that. And you would need a clever scheme to stabilize this dynamically. So the equations that construct these patterns would have to be a little bit different to destabilize ECPs and make that flow into a solution that is salt and peppery or disorganized in space. Yeah.
Cool. I think, yeah, if you guys want to play a bit, but we can take already the break. We have 5 minutes till 10:45. Yeah. Thank you, Manuel. It was great, given that you just arrived from the airport. So I'm very happy. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah, it's very energizing.